Marcus Chin opened his eyes to the familiar hum of artificial gravity generators and the distant thrum of fusion engines. The prison transport ship Maledict cut through the void like a dagger, carrying its cargo of the galaxy's most dangerous criminals toward their final destination. Around him, the holding bay stretched in all directions, a maze of reinforced containment cells designed to hold beings that could level cities with their bare hands. The Saurian in the cell across from him had been watching for the past 3 hours. Its yellow eyes, each the size of Marcus's fist, tracked every movement he made. When Marcus stretched his arms, the creature's forked tongue flicked out to taste the air. When he shifted his weight on the narrow bench that served as his bed, the Saurian's head tilted like a predator calculating the perfect moment to strike. "Still staring, Kronak?" Marcus asked, his voice carrying easily across the gap between their cells. The universal translator built into the ship systems rendered his words into the clicking, hissing language of the Saurian homeworld. Kronek's massive form uncoiled from where he had been crouched in the shadows. Standing upright, he towered nearly 10 feet tall, his scaled hide rippling with muscle that could crack stone. Bone spurs jutted from his forearms like natural blades, and his claws scraped against the reinforced floor as he approached the energy barrier that separated them. "Soft flesh," Kronek rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. "I have been wondering what crime such a delicate creature could commit to earn passage to Tartarus 9. Other prisoners had begun to take notice of their conversation. In the cell to Marcus's left, a Vortak battledrone's mechanical components whirred as it turned its attention toward them. The cyborg's remaining organic eye, a grotesque green orb nestled in a skull of twisted metal and synthetic flesh, fixed on Marcus with obvious interest. To his right, something that looked like a cross between a spider and a nightmare shifted in the perpetual darkness it generated around itself. The umbrals were creatures of living shadow, and this one had been convicted of consuming the life force of an entire planetary colony. "Tax evasion," Marcus replied with a straight face. The silence that followed was profound. Even the constant background chatter of 100 different species fell quiet as the implications of his words sank in. Then, Kronek's laughter began, a sound like boulders tumbling down a mountainside. It spread through the holding bay like wildfire, picked up by beings who understood the cosmic joke of it all. "Tax evasion," wheezed a mollusk thing whose name Marcus had never learned. Its voice bubbled through the breathing apparatus that kept its gills moist in the ship's atmosphere. "The soft flesh commits tax evasion. The Empire must be desperate for prisoners if they're shipping accountants to Tartarus," added the Vortak, its mechanical voicebox crackling with electronic amusement. But not everyone was laughing. In a cell 3 rows down, something large and predatory remained perfectly still. Marcus could feel its attention like a weight on his shoulders, though he couldn't see it clearly through the maze of containment units. Whatever it wasn't buying his joke. Neither was Kronek, Marcus realized. The Saurian's laughter had stopped as abruptly as it began, and those yellow eyes had narrowed to calculating slits. "You mock us," Kronek said quietly. "No being is sent to Tartarus 9 for financial crimes. The Empire has cheaper solutions for such irregularities." Marcus shrugged, settling back against the rear wall of his cell. The movement was casual, relaxed, but he could see how it affected the others. His apparent lack of concern in a place where fear should rule seemed to unsettle them more than any threat could have. "Maybe they just really hate tax evaders," he said. Or maybe, came a new voice from deeper in the bay, "the soft flesh is more dangerous than he appears." The speaker emerged from the shadows between the cells, a guard, but not one of the standard Zephyrian soldiers. This was something altogether more imposing. The enforcer stood 8 feet tall, its body encased in powered armor that gleamed with an oil-slick iridescence. Its face was hidden behind a featureless mask, but Marcus could feel the intensity of its gaze through the sensor array that served as its eyes. "Prisoner 7741, the enforcer said, its voice amplified by speakers built into its chest plate. "You will report to Interrogation Base 7 for processing." Marcus stood slowly, making no sudden movements. Around him, the other prisoners watched with renewed interest. Interrogation sessions during transport were unusual, most processing waited until they reached Tartarus 9. The fact that they were singling him out suggested something more than routine paperwork. "Tax problems?" Marcus asked the enforcer as he moved toward the cell door. The energy barrier flickered and died, allowing him to step through. Immediately, restraint fields activated around his wrists and ankles, not the heavy shackles used on physically powerful prisoners, but delicate energy cuffs that would deliver debilitating neural feedback if he tried to remove them. "Follow," the enforcer commanded. As they walked through the holding bay, Marcus became aware of how many eyes were tracking their movement. The conversation with Kronek had drawn attention from prisoners he hadn't even known were aboard. From a cell designed for atmospheric breathers, something that looked like a jellyfish made of living metal pressed against the transparent aluminum viewing port. In another section reserved for energy-based lifeforms, patterns of light shifted and pulsed in what might have been communication or simple curiosity. The corridors beyond the holding bay were different from the utilitarian prison sections. Here, the walls displayed the technological sophistication of the Zephyrian Empire in full glory. Holographic displays showed real-time updates from across their territory, trade routes, military deployments, diplomatic communications flowing between worlds that humanity had never even dreamed of. Marcus let his eyes wander across the information streams, filing away details with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to processing large amounts of data quickly. "Impressive," he commented to the enforcer. "The Empire's really stepped up their information management systems since the last time I saw them." The enforcer's head turned slightly, sensors focusing on Marcus with what felt like surprise. "You have encountered Imperial information systems before?" In passing, Marcus replied. "Before my tax troubles, I used to travel quite a bit." "You pick things up." They stopped before a door marked with symbols that Marcus recognized as high-level security classifications. The enforcer placed its armored hand on a scanner, and the door dissolved into component atoms before reforming behind them as they stepped through. Interrogation Bay 7 was smaller than Marcus had expected, dominated by a single chair surrounded by devices whose purpose he could only guess at. Some appeared to be scanners of various types, biological, mental, perhaps even temporal. Others looked more like restraints, designed to hold subjects who might possess strength or abilities beyond normal parameters. "Sit," the enforcer commanded. Marcus complied, settling into the chair with the same casual ease he had shown in his cell. The restraints activated automatically, energy fields forming around his arms and legs. A scanning array descended from the ceiling, bathing him in light that shifted through spectrums his eyes couldn't perceive. "Prisoner 7741, a new voice said. This one came from speakers hidden throughout the room, carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to absolute power. "You present an interesting puzzle." "I get that a lot," Marcus replied. "Your species file indicates that humans are a recently contacted race with minimal technological development and no significant military capability. Yet your transport orders bear security classifications typically reserved for beings capable of planetary destruction." The scanning array completed its sweep and retracted. Marcus felt the subtle tingle of various energy fields probing his body, mapping everything from his skeletal structure to his neural activity patterns. He made no effort to resist, partly because the restraints made resistance impossible, but mostly because he was genuinely curious about what they would find. According to Imperial records, the voice continued, "You arrived in Zephyrian space aboard a vessel of unknown configuration. The ship's design matched no known technology in our databases. When our patrol intercepted you, you surrendered without resistance and claimed to be guilty of financial irregularities." "Tax evasion," Marcus corrected. "It's important to be specific about these things." "Indeed. Yet when our forensic teams attempted to examine your vessel, they discovered that it had been constructed using materials and techniques that should not exist. The hull plating showed evidence of manufacturing processes that require temperatures exceeding the core of most stars. The propulsion system operated on principles that our best scientists describe as aggressively impossible." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I've always preferred to travel in style." The ship destroyed itself before a complete analysis could be performed. The explosion was comprehensive. It left no debris larger than a molecule and generated an energy signature that registered on sensors 3 systems away. "Insurance fraud," Marcus said sadly. "I'm afraid my crimes are more extensive than I initially admitted." The silence that followed stretched for nearly a minute. Marcus could almost feel the intelligence behind the voice trying to process his responses, searching for patterns that would explain why someone who spoke like a comedian had arrived in a ship that violated known physics. Your biological scans are equally puzzling, the voice finally continued. Your species appears to possess no natural weapons, minimal physical strength, and reaction times that would be considered sluggish by galactic standards. Yet our psychological profile suggests predatory instincts that exceed those found in apex hunters from worlds where survival requires constant warfare. I eat a lot of protein, Marcus offered. Your brain activity patterns show regions of development that we have never encountered in any sentient species. Areas associated with pattern recognition, strategic planning, and what our xenopsychologists can only describe as creative problem solving show activity levels that should not be sustainable in organic neural tissue. The restraints released him suddenly, energy fields winking out of existence. Marcus remained seated, showing no inclination to take advantage of his apparent freedom. Around him, the various scanning and analysis devices retreated into hidden recesses in the walls. Tell me, Prisoner 7741, the voice said, what do you know about the Hegemony War? Now Marcus's expression changed, though so subtly that only the most sophisticated sensors would have detected it. The casual, almost lazy demeanor remained, but something had shifted behind his eyes, a sharpening of focus that transformed his entire presence without altering a single visible feature. Ancient history, he said. Something about a galactic conflict that ended before humanity achieved faster than light travel. The Empire doesn't like to discuss it much. The Hegemony War lasted for 3,000 years, the voice said. It consumed entire sectors, depopulated worlds, and nearly brought civilization to an end. The enemy was unlike anything the galaxy had ever faced, a species that fought with such creativity, such relentless adaptability, that traditional warfare became impossible. They turned every weapon against its wielder, made every strength into a weakness, and treated the most desperate situations as merely interesting problems to be solved. Marcus listened without comment, his hands folded in his lap. The war ended when the enemy simply disappeared. No final battle, no negotiated peace. One day they were carving through our defenses like they were made of paper, and the next day they were gone. They left behind no colonies, no monuments, no trace of their civilization except for the scars they had carved across the galaxy. Sounds mysterious, Marcus said. We called them the Hegemony because they seemed determined to rule everything they encountered. But, in our oldest records, in files so classified that mentioning their existence is a capital crime, they had another name. One that our enemy used for themselves. Marcus waited. They called themselves humans. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This was the quiet of a universe holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen when two forces that should never meet were suddenly brought face to face. Marcus stood up slowly, and, for the first time since boarding the transport, he smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Well, he said, this conversation just became much more interesting. The enforcer that had brought him to the interrogation bay suddenly activated weapon systems that Marcus hadn't even known it possessed. Energy weapons extended from hidden compartments in its arms, targeting systems locked onto his position, and threat assessment algorithms began calculating optimal firing solutions. Marcus looked at the impressive display of firepower and chuckled. You know, he said, I really was trying to keep a low profile this time. The weapons trained on Marcus hummed with barely contained energy, each one capable of reducing a normal humanoid to constituent atoms in microseconds. The enforcer's targeting systems had locked onto 17 different vital points on his body, and threat assessment protocols recommended immediate termination. Marcus examined his fingernails with casual interest. You know, he said conversationally, the last time someone pointed that many weapons at me, it was on Kepler 442b. Beautiful planet, really. Oxygen-rich atmosphere, 3 moons, and the most gorgeous auroras you've ever seen. The locals had developed these fascinating crystal and energy weapons that could cut through just about anything. The voice from the hidden speakers had fallen silent, but Marcus could sense the attention focused on him like a physical weight. Somewhere in the ship's command structure, beings far more dangerous than the enforcer were making calculations, running scenarios, preparing responses to a threat they were only beginning to understand. The thing about energy weapons, Marcus continued, still studying his nails, is that they're really just applied physics. And physics, well, physics has rules. Once you understand the rules, you can usually find interesting ways to bend them. Remain stationary, the enforcer commanded, its mechanical voice carrying new harmonics of urgency. Any movement will result in immediate termination. Marcus looked up at the towering figure with what appeared to be genuine surprise. Oh, I'm not going anywhere. I'm actually quite comfortable here. It's been a while since I've had such an engaging conversation. You claim to be human, the voice from the speakers said, returning with what sounded like forced calm. But, the humans in our databases are a primitive species that has barely begun to explore their own solar system. Databases can be so unreliable, Marcus replied. Especially when the people providing the information have reasons to be selective with the truth. He stood up from the chair, and every weapon in the room tracked his movement. Energy levels spiked to maximum charge, ready to fire at the first sign of aggressive action. Marcus walked to one of the walls, apparently oblivious to the arsenal aimed at his back, and began examining the various scanning devices that had retracted into their housings. Fascinating technology, he murmured, running his fingers along surfaces that should have been impossible to access. You've made some real advances in quantum scale manipulation since the war ended. The energy efficiency alone must have required completely new approaches to field theory. How do you possess knowledge of our classified research? The voice demanded. Marcus paused in his examination and turned back toward the center of the room. The smile he wore was the same one he had shown in his cell, pleasant, almost friendly. But now it seemed to carry implications that made the air itself feel dangerous. You really want to know? He asked. The enforcer's weapons powered down slightly, though they remained aimed at him. Somewhere in the ship's command center, Marcus could imagine the frantic consultations taking place. Protocol said that he should be dead already, but protocol had been written for conventional threats. No one had developed procedures for handling a prisoner who discussed classified technology like he was commenting on the weather. Very well, the voice said. Explain. Marcus settled back into the interrogation chair, making himself comfortable. It's actually a rather interesting story. You see, when the hegemony war ended, humanity didn't just disappear. We went home. Impossible. Our long-range surveys of the Sol system show no evidence of advanced civilization. Of course they don't. Did you really think we'd make the same mistake twice? Marcus laughed, and the sound carried no humor at all. The first time we encountered the galactic community, we did exactly what you'd expect from a young, naive species. We announced ourselves, shared our location, demonstrated our capabilities, and generally made ourselves as visible as possible. He gestured toward the walls around them. And look how that worked out. 3,000 years of warfare, entire sectors burned to ash, billions dead on both sides. By the time it ended, we'd learned some important lessons about galactic politics. The scanning array descended from the ceiling again, this time moving much more slowly. Marcus watched its approach with apparent interest, making no move to avoid its sensors. Lesson 1, he continued as exotic energy frequencies washed over him, is that the galaxy is not a friendly place for species that advertise their capabilities. Lesson 2 is that sometimes the best way to win a war is to make your enemies forget they were fighting one. You're claiming that humanity staged its own disappearance, the voice said, incredulity clear even through the artificial speakers. Staged? No, nothing so dramatic. We simply went home and minded our own business. Pulled back all our ships, abandoned our colonies, erased our presence from the galactic information networks. As far as the rest of the universe was concerned, the humans had vanished without a trace. The scanning array completed its sweep and retracted. Marcus could sense the frustration of whoever was operating it. Every scan produced data that contradicted fundamental assumptions about human capabilities. But we didn't stop watching, Marcus said softly. We just got much better at it. The surveillance networks that monitor Sol systems show no signs of the surveillance networks? Marcus interrupted, his tone suggesting polite confusion. You mean those charming little probe clusters in the Kuiper belt? The ones that have been faithfully reporting the same data for the past 50 years? The silence that followed was profound. You've been feeding us false information, the voice said, and, for the first time, it carried undertones of what might have been fear. False is such an ugly word. Curated, perhaps. Selective. We've been very careful to show you exactly what we wanted you to see: a developing species that poses no threat to galactic stability. Meanwhile, the real human civilization has been doing what humans do best. Which is? Marcus's smile widened. Learning. Adapting. Preparing. The Enforcer's weapons snapped back to full charge, energy crackling along their barrels. You admit to conducting espionage against the Empire. Espionage? Marcus looked genuinely hurt. I prefer to think of it as anthropological research. We've been studying galactic civilization for 3 centuries now, cataloging technologies, analyzing social structures, identifying strengths and weaknesses. It's been absolutely fascinating. He stood up again and began pacing around the small room, apparently oblivious to the fact that multiple targeting systems were tracking his every movement. Take the Zephyrian Empire, for example. Impressive territorial control, sophisticated technology, effective military organization. But there are some interesting vulnerabilities built into your core systems. Elaborate. Well, for starters, your entire command and control network relies on quantum entanglement communicators that operate on a very specific frequency range. Elegant solution for faster-than-light communication, but it creates some rather obvious points of failure. The voice from the speakers had gone very quiet. That information is classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. Is it? How unfortunate for you. Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at one of the hidden surveillance cameras. You know what's funny about classification systems? They're designed to protect information from enemies who don't already have it. You're threatening the Empire. Threatening? Marcus looked genuinely surprised. Not at all. I'm just making conversation. After all, you asked me to explain how I knew about your technology. I'm simply being thorough. He moved toward one of the walls again, this time stopping in front of what appeared to be a solid metal panel. His hand moved across its surface in a pattern that seemed random, but Marcus could hear the subtle changes in the ship's background hum that indicated he had accessed something he shouldn't have been able to reach. For instance, he continued as holographic displays began materializing in the air around him. Your ship's defensive systems are quite impressive. Energy shields rated for capital ship weapons, armor plating that can withstand direct nuclear bombardment, and enough firepower to level a small city. The displays showed detailed schematics of the ship's weapon systems, shield generators, and life support infrastructure. Information that should have been accessible only to the ship's senior officers was floating in the air like party decorations. Unfortunately, Marcus said, pointing to specific components in the schematics, there's a design flaw in the power coupling between your main reactor and your defensive grid. Nothing major, really. Just a small vulnerability that would allow someone with the right knowledge to overload the entire system using nothing more than a standard personal communicator. The Enforcer's weapons swiveled toward the holographic displays, as if the information itself posed a physical threat. How are you accessing classified systems? Oh, I'm not accessing anything, Marcus replied cheerfully. These schematics were compiled from purely observational data. Hull resonance patterns, electromagnetic emissions, gravitational field fluctuations. Your ship has been telling me all about itself since the moment I came aboard. He gestured, and the displays changed to show detailed crew manifest information, complete with psychological profiles and duty assignments. Captain Vextai, for example. Excellent service record, decorated veteran of the Rim Wars, but she has a tendency toward overconfidence when facing apparently inferior opponents. Currently suffering from moderate sleep deprivation due to the stress of transporting high-value prisoners. The voice from the speakers had taken on a new quality, still controlled, but carrying undertones of something that might have been panic. This is impossible. Even our most advanced AIs cannot perform the analysis you're describing. AIs, Marcus said thoughtfully. Yes, we've noticed your reliance on artificial intelligence for complex problem solving. Very efficient, and your systems are certainly impressive by galactic standards. But they do have some interesting limitations. He turned away from the displays and fixed his attention on the surveillance camera again. Tell me, when your AIs encounter a problem they can't solve, what do? They either request additional processing resources or escalate to higher level systems. Exactly. They follow their programming, seek more data, apply additional computational power. Very logical, very predictable. Marcus's smile had taken on a quality that made the temperature in the room seem to drop. Humans don't work that way. Explain. When a human encounters an impossible problem, we don't look for more data or processing power. We change the rules of the problem itself. The holographic displays around Marcus began shifting, showing new information, star charts, fleet dispositions, strategic assessments that painted a picture of Imperial military capabilities across dozens of sectors. But now the data was overlaid with analysis that revealed patterns invisible to conventional strategic thinking. Your empire controls approximately 40% of this galactic arm, Marcus observed, manipulating the displays with casual ease. Impressive expansion rate, especially considering the resistance from established powers. But there's something interesting about your expansion pattern. He highlighted specific systems on the star chart, connecting them with glowing lines that revealed a complex geometric pattern. You're not expanding randomly. You're following a very specific strategy designed to control key gravitational nexuses that will allow rapid fleet deployment across multiple sectors. That strategy is classified. Oh, I'm sure it is. And it's quite clever, really. Control the right systems and you can project power anywhere in the galaxy within a few weeks. Very efficient. The pattern on the star chart grew more complex, revealing layers of strategic planning that had taken Imperial strategists decades to develop. But it does create some interesting vulnerabilities. The displays zoomed in on a cluster of systems near the galactic core, showing fleet positions and defensive installations. For instance, if someone were to disrupt the gravitational nexus at Kepler 442b. Marcus paused, and his expression shifted to something that looked almost nostalgic. Beautiful planet, as I mentioned. I spent some time there during my travels. The star chart showed the cascade effect that would result from disrupting that single system, supply lines cut, fleet deployments delayed, entire sectors left defenseless. It was a strategic nightmare that no conventional military analysis would have identified. You're describing an act of war against the Empire, the voice said, but it no longer carried the authority it had possessed at the beginning of their conversation. Am I? Marcus asked innocently. I thought I was just discussing the theoretical vulnerabilities inherent in centralized strategic planning. You know, academic exercise. Purely hypothetical. He gestured again, and the displays vanished. The wall panel sealed itself, leaving no trace that it had ever been accessed. Marcus returned to the interrogation chair and settled back into it as if nothing had happened. But, you asked about the hegemony war, he said, returning to his original pleasant tone. And I'm afraid I haven't really answered your question yet. The enforcers' weapons were still trained on him, but Marcus could sense the uncertainty behind their targeting systems. Protocol demanded his immediate execution, but protocol had been written before anyone understood what they were really dealing with. The war ended, Marcus continued, because we accomplished what we set out to do. Not conquest, that was never really the goal. We were trying to understand how the galactic community worked, what made it tick, where its strengths and weaknesses lay. You fought a 3,000-year war as a research project? Research, field testing, practical education. Call it what you like. Marcus shrugged. Humans learn by doing, and there's nothing quite like warfare for revealing the true nature of a civilization. By the time we were finished, we understood your technology, your social structures, your strategic thinking, and your psychological patterns better than you understood them yourselves. And then, you vanished. We went home to process what we'd learned. It took us about 2 centuries to fully analyze all the data we'd collected and develop appropriate responses to what we discovered. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his casual demeanor unchanged. The last century has been spent implementing those responses. Implementation? Preparation, Marcus corrected. Making sure that when we returned to galactic society, we'd be ready for whatever reception we might encounter. He stood up one final time and walked toward the door. The enforcer's weapons tracked him, but no order came to fire. Which brings us to the present situation. You see, I really was trying to keep a low profile this time. My mission was supposed to be simple reconnaissance, check on current Imperial capabilities, assess any technological developments we might have missed, maybe update our files on a few key strategic systems. But you were captured. Was I? Marcus reached the door and placed his hand on its surface. The security panel, which should have required command-level authorization to access, responded immediately to his touch. Or did I simply decide that it was time to have this conversation? The door dissolved, revealing the corridor beyond. The enforcer remained frozen in place, its weapons still powered but unable to fire without direct authorization that seemed unwilling to come. Marcus paused in the doorway and looked back toward the surveillance camera one final time. "Thank you for the interrogation," he said politely. "It's been very educational. I think I have all the information I need now." As he stepped into the corridor, the ship's lights flickered. For just a moment, every system aboard the prison transport experienced a brief interruption, nothing serious, just a gentle reminder of how easily their most secure technologies could be touched by someone who truly understood their weaknesses. Marcus Chen, the human who had been dismissed as a harmless tax evader, began walking back toward the holding bay. Behind him, the most sophisticated security systems in the known galaxy struggled to comprehend how their most dangerous prisoner had just walked away from an interrogation chamber without raising an alarm. In the holding bay, 100 different species waited in their cells, unaware that everything they thought they knew about the balance of power in the galaxy had just changed forever. The soft-skinned human was coming back. And now they were going to learn what had really happened to the hegemony. Marcus returned to the holding bay to find chaos. The energy barriers that had contained the prisoners were flickering erratically, cycling between full power and complete shutdown in patterns that seemed random but felt somehow purposeful. Guards stationed throughout the bay were speaking in urgent whispers into their communication devices, receiving no responses from the command deck. Emergency lighting had activated, bathing everything in the red glow that meant the ship's automated systems were struggling with problems they couldn't identify. And the prisoners were talking. Not the casual conversation that had filled the bay before, but intense, focused discussions between beings who had spent their entire lives learning to recognize genuine threats. They had felt something change in the ship's fabric, a shift in the balance of power that every predator instinct they possessed told them to pay attention to. Kronek was pressed against the front of his cell, yellow eyes fixed on the corridor entrance where Marcus emerged. "The soft flesh returns," he announced, his voice carrying clearly through the bay. "And the ship trembles." Marcus walked casually back to his cell, nodding politely to the other prisoners as he passed. The energy barrier that should have activated automatically to contain him remained stubbornly inactive, forcing him to step through empty air into the space where solid energy should have blocked his path. "Apologies for the delay," he said to no one in particular. "Bureaucracy, you know how it is." The Vortex mechanical systems whirred with increased activity, sensors and analysis protocols working overtime to process new data. "Explain the system failures," it demanded, its electronic voice carrying harmonics of confusion. "System failures?" Marcus looked around the bay with apparent surprise. "I don't see any system failures. Everything seems to be working exactly as intended." "The containment barriers are malfunctioning," Kronek said, testing his own barrier with a massive claw. It sparked against the energy field but did not pass through. "Are they?" Marcus examined his own barrier more closely, waving his hand through the space where it should have been active. "Seems to be working fine to me." The implications of what they were seeing slowly sank in throughout the holding bay. The barriers weren't malfunctioning, they were responding to some kind of selective override that affected only Marcus's cell. Someone, or something, had gained access to the ship's security systems and was demonstrating that access in the most visible way possible. You whispered something from the shadows between cells. It was the first time the umbral had spoken, its voice like wine through a graveyard. You did this. Marcus settled onto his bench and shrugged. I walked back to my cell. That's hardly doing anything. No human possesses the technological capability to override Imperial security systems, the Vorthack stated with mechanical certainty. You're absolutely right, Marcus agreed. No human does possess that capability. He let the implications of his words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. But, then, again, I never said I was just a human. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of heavy footsteps in the corridor outside. A full squad of enforcers was approaching, their powered armor clanking against the deck plates with each step. Behind them came something else, a presence that made the air itself seem heavier. Commander Thexbar entered the holding bay like a force of nature. The Zephyrian officer stood 7 feet tall even without the ceremonial armor that marked her rank, her scaled hide bearing the ritual scars that indicated a lifetime spent in combat. Her eyes were the color of molten gold, and they fixed on Marcus with the intensity of a predator that had finally identified its prey. Prisoner 7741, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. You will accompany me to the command deck. Marcus looked up from examining his fingernails. I'm actually quite comfortable here. But, thank you for the invitation. Thexbar's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the bay seemed to drop several degrees. It was not an invitation. Ah. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. In that case, I'm afraid I'll have to decline even more politely. The enforcers raised their weapons in perfect synchronization, energy charges building to lethal levels. Around the bay, other prisoners pressed against their barriers to get a better view of what promised to be either an execution or something far more interesting. You seem to be under the impression that you have a choice in this matter, Thexbar said. Everyone has choices, Marcus replied. The trick is understanding what they really are. He stood up and walked toward the front of his cell, passing through the space where the energy barrier should have stopped him. The enforcers' weapons tracked his movement, but their targeting systems seemed to be having difficulty maintaining locks. Red warning lights flickered across their tactical displays as their equipment struggled with sensor readings that made no sense. For instance, Marcus continued conversationally, you could try to take me to your command deck by force. Your weapons are certainly impressive enough to vaporize me several times over. But that creates some interesting complications. Such as? Marcus smiled, and several of the prisoners who were watching felt an instinctive urge to back away from their viewing positions. Well, for starters, it would be terribly impolite to kill your guests before properly entertaining them. And I've been looking forward to seeing how your command systems handle unexpected input. What do you mean by unexpected input? Instead of answering directly, Marcus reached into what appeared to be an empty pocket of his prison uniform and withdrew something that shouldn't have existed. It was a device roughly the size and shape of a communication tablet, but its surface displayed patterns of light that seemed to shift and flow like living things. Fascinating what you can build when you really understand the underlying physics, Marcus observed, holding the device up for examination. Your security scans were quite thorough, but they were looking for conventional technology. This operates on principles that most galactic civilizations haven't even theorized yet. Thexbar's hand moved instinctively toward her sidearm, but she stopped herself before drawing it. How did you smuggle contraband past Imperial security systems? Smuggle? Marcus looked hurt. I didn't smuggle anything. I built this from components that were already aboard your ship. He gestured toward the walls around them. Molecular fabricators in the food dispensers, quantum processors in the environmental controls, exotic matter reserves in the ship's reactor. Really, your technology is quite sophisticated. It just needed a little creative repurposing. The device in his hands began emitting a soft harmonic tone that seemed to resonate with the ship's superstructure. Throughout the bay, prisoners began to notice subtle changes in their environment. The lights brightened slightly, the air circulation improved, and the constant background hum of the ship's engines took on a more pleasant quality. You're interfacing directly with our systems, Thexbar said, incredulity creeping into her voice despite her attempts to maintain command composure. Interfacing is such a crude word, Marcus replied. I prefer to think of it as having a conversation. Your ship's AI is actually quite chatty once you know how to speak its language. Throughout the holding bay, cell barriers began shifting colors as their energy signatures changed. Not failing, but responding to new programming that integrated seamlessly with their existing protocols. Red containment fields shifted to blue, then green, then colors that had no names in any galactic language. You see, Marcus continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that he was committing acts that should have been physically impossible. The problem with most galactic technology is that it's designed by beings who think in terms of discrete systems. Ships, weapons, computers, communication arrays, all separate tools that interface through predetermined protocols. The device in his hands pulsed brighter, and new displays began materializing throughout the bay. Not holographic projections, but actual modifications to the existing surfaces that transformed walls and floors into interactive information systems. Humans think differently, Marcus said. We see everything as part of a single, interconnected system. Your ship isn't a collection of separate technologies, it's a unified organism with its own intelligence, its own desires, its own potential for growth. He gestured with the device, and the displays began showing real-time telemetry from throughout the ship. Engine performance, crew vital signs, weapon status, environmental controls, everything flowing together in patterns that revealed the vessel's complete operational state. And, like any intelligent organism, Marcus continued, it can learn new tricks when properly motivated. The Enforcer's weapons had begun displaying error messages as their targeting systems struggled with input that violated their basic assumptions about how technology worked. Their armor's threat assessment protocols were recommending immediate retreat from a target that registered simultaneously as completely harmless and impossibly dangerous. What do you want? Thexvar demanded. Want? Marcus looked genuinely surprised by the question. I don't want anything from you. I'm simply demonstrating the futility of trying to contain something you don't understand. He touched the device's surface, and every screen in the holding bay began displaying the same image, a star chart showing the current location of their ship, with trajectory lines indicating their planned route to Tartarus 9. But, overlaid on the standard navigation data were additional projections that showed dozens of other paths, routes that led to destinations throughout Imperial space. Your ship could go anywhere from here, Marcus observed. Any system, any world, any point in the galaxy that supports life. The engines are certainly powerful enough, the navigation systems are more than adequate, and the fuel reserves could sustain faster than light travel for months. The ship is under automated control, Thexvar said. The navigation systems cannot be altered without command authorization codes that you do not possess. Marcus tilted his head slightly, and the expression on his face shifted to something that looked almost pitying. Commander, I'm not trying to steal your ship. I'm trying to help you understand what you're really dealing with. The star chart changed, zooming out to show the entire galactic arm. Imperial territory was highlighted in red, covering the vast swath of space that the Zephyrians had claimed over centuries of expansion. But, now other areas began lighting up, systems marked in blue that indicated human presence. There were thousands of them. Impossible, Thexvar breathed. Our surveys show no evidence of human civilization beyond the Sol system. Your surveys show exactly what we wanted them to show, Marcus corrected gently. But, the reality is quite different. The display zoomed in on specific systems, revealing installations that dwarfed anything in Imperial space. Orbital habitats that housed billions, manufacturing complexes that turned entire moons into industrial centers, defensive arrays that could have held off Imperial fleets without strain. We've been busy during our absence, Marcus said. 3 centuries of technological development without the distractions of galactic politics tends to produce interesting results. Why are you showing us this? Thexvar asked. Because, Marcus said, his tone becoming more serious, your empire is about to make a very serious mistake. The display shifted again, showing Imperial fleet movements throughout Zephyrian space. Normal strategic deployments, routine patrol assignments, standard operational procedures that had been in place for decades. But, overlaid on the tactical information were analysis patterns that revealed something far more ominous. Your military forces are positioning themselves for a major offensive, Marcus observed. 50 battle groups reassigned to border sectors, supply lines reorganized for extended campaigns, intelligence gathering focused on species that haven't shown any aggressive intentions. The Empire's military deployments are classified. Commander, Marcus interrupted, your entire strategic planning process has been compromised for longer than you've been alive. Every fleet movement, every tactical decision, every classified briefing has been monitored, analyzed, and cataloged by observers you never knew existed. The implications of what he was saying began to sink in throughout the holding bay. If humanity possessed the capabilities he was claiming, then everything the galactic community thought it knew about the balance of power was fundamentally wrong. The offensive you're planning, Marcus continued, targets 17 different species that Imperial strategists have classified as potential threats. Species that have resources your empire wants, territories that would provide strategic advantages, or technologies that might challenge Zephyrian dominance. Thexbar's golden eyes had narrowed to slits. How do you possess this information? Because, Marcus said quietly, 12 of those 17 species have been under human protection for the past 2 centuries. They may not know it, they may never have seen direct evidence of it, but they're not alone in the galaxy. And an attack on them would be considered an act of war against humanity. The device in his hands pulsed one final time, and every system in the holding bay returned to normal operation. The modified displays faded, the cell barriers resumed their standard energy signatures, and the enhanced environmental controls reverted to baseline settings. That, Marcus said, tucking the device back into his apparently empty pocket, would be an extremely unfortunate outcome for everyone involved. He returned to his bench and settled back into his previous casual position. So, Commander, would you still like to escort me to your command deck? Or would you prefer to contact your superiors and suggest that they reconsider their current strategic planning? Thexbar stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Around the bay, prisoners who had witnessed the demonstration were silent, each processing what they had seen in their own way. Finally, she spoke. What are you? Marcus smiled, and, for the first time since boarding the transport, it was a completely genuine expression. I'm exactly what I told you from the beginning, Commander. I'm a human being who's very, very good with tax returns. And, Marcus said, his smile widening, I'm about to give your empire the most important financial advice it's ever received. Commander Thexbar did not escort Marcus to the command deck. Instead, she ordered the immediate lockdown of the entire holding bay, posted additional guards at every access point, and sent an emergency transmission to Imperial High Command using the ship's most secure communication channels. The message was brief, coded in encryption protocols that would take conventional computers centuries to break, and marked with threat classifications that hadn't been used since the Hegemony War. Marcus remained on his bench, apparently oblivious to the security measures being implemented around him. He had produced a small object from his pocket, not the reality-defying device he had used earlier, but something that looked suspiciously like a standard accounting pad. Numbers scrolled across its surface in neat columns as he worked through calculations that seemed to require his complete attention. The other prisoners watched him with a mixture of fascination and unease. Word of what had happened during the demonstration had spread through the bay despite the guards' attempts to maintain information security. Beings who had spent their lives as apex predators found themselves confronting the possibility that they had completely misjudged the most dangerous thing in their environment. He's still just sitting there, Kronek observed, his massive frame pressed against the front of his cell. After everything he did, everything he showed us, he's calculating numbers like a merchant. Perhaps that's exactly what he is, suggested the Vorthok. Its cybernetic systems had been running diagnostic checks continuously since Marcus's demonstration, trying to understand how he had interfaced with technology that should have been completely incompatible with organic neural patterns. Perhaps we have been thinking about this incorrectly. Explain, the Umbral whispered from its shadowy corner. We have been assuming that the human represents a military threat, the Vorthok said. But his actions suggest something different. He has not attempted to escape, has not harmed anyone, has not even demonstrated personal combat capabilities. He subverted our entire security system, Kronek pointed out. To prove a point, not to cause damage. And what point was he proving? The prisoners fell silent as they considered the question. Marcus had shown them capabilities that defied understanding, revealed intelligence networks that spanned the galaxy, and demonstrated technological superiority that made their captors look primitive. But he had done it all in service of what appeared to be a conversation about economics. Financial advice, one of the other prisoners said suddenly. It was a being whose species Marcus hadn't encountered before, something with too many arms and eyes that glowed like stars. He said he was going to give the Empire financial advice. Marcus looked up from his calculations, apparently noticing their discussion for the first time. Oh, you were listening to that part? Excellent. I was hoping someone would pick up on the implications. What implications? Kronek demanded. Well, Marcus said, setting aside his accounting pad, it occurred to me during my conversation with Commander Thexbar that we might be approaching this situation from the wrong angle entirely. He stood up and began pacing around his cell, or rather, around the space where his cell should have been, since the energy barrier remained conspicuously inactive. Everyone keeps focusing on military capabilities, strategic advantages, technological superiorities. All very dramatic, but ultimately beside the point. The point being, the Vorthak inquired. Economics, Marcus said simply. Specifically, the economic realities of interstellar warfare in the current galactic political climate. He gestured toward the walls around them, and new displays began materializing, not the overwhelming demonstration he had provided earlier, but simple charts and graphs that showed resource allocation patterns throughout Imperial space. Take the Zephyrian Empire, for example. Impressive military force, vast territorial holdings, sophisticated technology. But look at the underlying economic fundamentals. The displays showed trade route efficiency ratings, resource extraction costs, infrastructure maintenance requirements, and military expenditure projections. The picture they painted was of an empire straining under the weight of its own expansion. The problem with rapid territorial acquisition, Marcus explained, is that it creates exponentially increasing administrative overhead. Every new system requires garrison forces, every new trade route needs protection, every new species demands integration into existing governmental structures. More data appeared, showing the mathematical relationships between territorial size and governance costs. The graphs formed curves that rose steadily at first, then began climbing at increasingly steep angles. At current expansion rates, Marcus continued, the Empire will reach a sustainability tipping point within the next 50 years. The cost of maintaining control over existing territories will exceed the economic benefits of acquiring new ones. Impossible, one of the guards said from his position near the bay entrance. The Empire's economic analysts have projected continued growth for centuries. Marcus turned toward the guard with what appeared to be genuine sympathy. I'm sure they have. But imperial economic models are based on assumptions that are no longer accurate. Such as the assumption that you're the only major power capable of large-scale strategic thinking. Marcus's expression became more serious. The galaxy isn't empty, and it isn't filled with primitive species that will inevitably submit to imperial expansion. There are other forces at work, other civilizations pursuing their own goals, other economic systems that don't follow imperial paradigms. The displays shifted to show a broader view of galactic economic activity. Imperial trade appeared as red flows of goods and services, but now they were overlaid with blue patterns that revealed something far more extensive, a parallel economy that operated independently of imperial control. Human economic activity, Marcus explained, represents approximately 30% of total galactic trade volume. Not bad for a species that officially doesn't exist beyond its home system. The numbers were staggering. Resource flows that dwarfed imperial commerce, manufacturing outputs that exceeded the combined production of entire imperial sectors, financial networks that moved wealth on scales that made imperial treasuries look like personal savings accounts. But that's not the interesting part, Marcus continued. The interesting part is how this parallel economy interacts with imperial expansion. New graphs appeared, showing correlation patterns between imperial territorial acquisition and economic disruption in adjacent regions. Every time the empire expanded into a new sector, trade efficiency in surrounding areas decreased. Not because of direct interference, but because of the subtle reorganization of economic relationships that occurred when human-protected systems adjusted their trading patterns. Every world you conquer, Marcus said quietly, costs you the economic cooperation of 3 worlds you haven't conquered yet. Every species you subjugate reduces the efficiency of your trade relationships with species that remain independent. You're describing economic warfare, Commander Thexvar said. She had returned to the holding bay, apparently drawn by reports of Marcus's latest demonstration.
Am I? Marcus asked innocently. I thought I was describing market forces.
Supply, demand, competitive advantage, basic economic principles that operate regardless of political intentions.
You're deliberately manipulating galactic commerce to undermine imperial expansion.
Commander, Marcus said with apparent patience, we don't need to manipulate anything.
We just need to provide alternatives.
The display showed specific examples, trade agreements between human-protected systems and species in imperial border regions, economic partnerships that offered better terms than imperial commercial arrangements, technological exchanges that bypassed imperial patent restrictions. Free market economics, Marcus explained. When species have choices, they tend to choose the options that provide the best value.
And humanity has gotten very, very good at providing value. This is still economic warfare, Thexvar insisted. Is it warfare when you offer someone a better deal than their current supplier? Is it aggression when you provide goods and services that people actually want? Is it an attack when you respect the sovereignty of trading partners instead of demanding political submission?
Marcus settled back onto his bench, but kept the displays active. The Empire calls it economic warfare because you've forgotten what actual free trade looks like. Your economic model is based on conquest and extraction, take what you want, impose the terms you prefer, eliminate competition through military force.
It's an effective model, Thexvar said defensively. In the short term, absolutely.
Very effective for rapid expansion, quick resource acquisition, immediate territorial control. Marcus nodded appreciatively. But it's not sustainable, and it's not competitive against alternatives that offer genuine mutual benefit. He gestured toward the economic data still floating in the air around them.
Look at the long-term projections.
In 50 years, at current expansion rates, the Empire will control twice as much territory as it does today.
But the cost of maintaining that control will consume 80% of imperial economic output. Our economic advisors disagree with your projections. I'm sure they do.
But their models don't account for variables they don't know exist.
Marcus's expression became almost sympathetic.
Commander, your empire is planning a military offensive against 17 species, most of which are under human economic protection.
Do your advisors' models account for what happens when those trading relationships are severed?
New data appeared, showing the cascade effects that would result from disrupting the economic networks that connected human-protected systems with imperial border regions. Trade route efficiency would collapse, resource costs would skyrocket, and entire imperial sectors would find themselves cut off from supply chains they didn't know they depended on. Economic collapse, Marcus said matter-of-factly. Not immediately, and not everywhere at once. But a gradual degradation of imperial economic efficiency that would cripple your ability to maintain military forces in conquered territories.
You're threatening to destroy our economy if we proceed with military expansion, Thexvar said. I'm not threatening anything, Marcus replied.
I'm simply explaining the natural consequences of your strategic choices.
If you attack systems that are integrated into human economic networks, those networks will respond by protecting their investments. And if we don't attack?
Marcus smiled, and, for the first time since the conversation began, it looked genuinely friendly.
If you don't attack, then nothing changes. Your current economic relationships continue operating exactly as they are now. Trade remains profitable, resources remain available, and the empire continues functioning within its existing territorial boundaries. You're offering us a choice between economic collapse and territorial stagnation. I'm offering you a choice between guaranteed economic collapse and continued economic stability. Marcus stood up and walked toward the front of his cell area. But there is a third option. Which is partnership. The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Around the holding bay, prisoners who had been following the conversation fell completely silent. Even the guards seemed to have stopped breathing. Explain, Thexvar said finally. Marcus gestured, and the displays around them changed completely. Instead of showing economic warfare projections or resource allocation problems, they began displaying something that looked like architectural blueprints, not for buildings, but for entire economic systems. Humanity has spent 3 centuries developing post-scarcity economic models, Marcus said. Systems that generate wealth instead of redistributing it, technologies that create resources instead of consuming them, social structures that encourage cooperation instead of competition. The blueprints showed the mathematical frameworks underlying these systems, equations that described how energy and matter could be transformed into goods and services without depleting the underlying resource base, algorithms that optimized production and distribution for maximum benefit to all participants. We're not interested in conquering the galaxy, Marcus continued. Conquest is inefficient, administration is expensive, and empire building generates more problems than it solves. But we are interested in sharing what we've learned with civilizations that are ready for it. What would such a partnership involve? Thexvar asked. Technology transfer, economic integration, and political cooperation. Marcus pointed to specific elements in the blueprints. The empire keeps its territorial integrity and governmental autonomy, but gains access to technologies that would eliminate resource scarcity and manufacturing limitations. In exchange for? Abandoning territorial expansion through military conquest and agreeing to respect the sovereignty of species that prefer independence. The silence that followed was profound. Thexvar stared at the displays, her golden eyes tracking through the mathematical proofs that demonstrated the feasibility of what Marcus was proposing. The numbers were compelling economic output that exceeded current imperial capabilities by orders of magnitude, resource availability that would make current scarcity concerns irrelevant, social stability that would eliminate the need for military pacification. Why? She asked finally. Because, Marcus said, the galaxy is a very large place, and there's room for everyone to prosper. But only if we stop trying to take things away from each other and start working together to create new things. He gestured again, and the displays faded. The holding bay returned to its normal appearance, leaving only the memory of possibilities that might reshape the fundamental nature of galactic civilization. So, Commander, Marcus said, settling back onto his bench, would you like to continue transporting me to Tartarus 9? Or would you prefer to contact your superiors and suggest that they might want to have a somewhat different conversation about humanity's return to galactic society? Commander Thexvar looked at him for a long moment, then activated her personal communicator. This is Commander Thexvar to Imperial High Command, she said. I need to speak with the Economic Council immediately. And, possibly the Emperor himself. Marcus smiled and returned to his accounting pad. Excellent, he said. I do so enjoy productive financial consultations. The Imperial response came faster than anyone had expected. Within 6 hours of Commander Thexvar's transmission, the prison transport Mal-Edict found itself surrounded by the largest Imperial fleet assembly in recent memory. 12 dreadnoughts formed the outer perimeter, their massive hulls bristling with weapons that could crack planetary crusts. Inside that ring, heavy cruisers and destroyers maintained precise formations that spoke of military planning at the highest levels. And, at the center of it all, emerging from a hyperspace jump that lit the void like a newborn star, came the Imperial flagship Dominion. Marcus watched the fleet assembly through displays that materialized whenever he wanted them, appearing on any surface that struck his fancy. The other prisoners had given up trying to understand how he accessed the ship's systems. It seemed as natural to him as breathing, and about as noteworthy. Impressive response time, he commented to no one in particular. Your communication networks really have improved since the war. They're here to negotiate, asked the Vorthak, its mechanical systems still struggling to process the economic data Marcus had shared. Oh, I doubt it, Marcus replied cheerfully. Fleet formations like that don't suggest negotiation.
They suggest the kind of firepower demonstration that's supposed to make problematic prisoners very cooperative. Kronek had been silent since Marcus's economic presentation, but now he stirred in his cell.
You do not seem concerned by the arrival of an Imperial battle fleet. Should I be? Marcus asked. It's not as if they're going to open fire on a transport full of their own prisoners. And, even if they did, well. He shrugged. Mathematics is mathematics, regardless of how many guns are pointed at you.
What do you mean? The Umbral whispered from its shadows. Marcus gestured toward the display showing the fleet positions, and new information began overlaying the tactical readouts.
Take a look at their formation.
Classic Imperial intimidation deployment, maximum visible firepower, optimal firing solutions, enough concentrated force to sterilize a small moon. The tactical displays highlighted weapon positions, shield generators, and command structures throughout the fleet. It was indeed an impressive demonstration of military might, the kind that had convinced hundreds of species to surrender rather than face Imperial wrath. But, Marcus continued, look at what they're not showing you.
The display shifted, revealing gaps in the formation that weren't immediately obvious.
Sensor shadows where ships blocked each other's scanning ability, communication dead zones where interference patterns created information delays, and power distribution inefficiencies that resulted from maintaining such an aggressive posture. Imperial fleet doctrine emphasizes psychological impact over tactical flexibility, Marcus explained. Very effective for intimidating potential enemies, but it creates vulnerabilities that a prepared opponent could exploit.
You're analyzing their weaknesses, Commander Thexbar said.
She had returned to oversee the fleet rendezvous personally, and she'd been listening to Marcus's commentary with growing unease.
I'm admiring their engineering, Marcus corrected. Imperial ship design has come a long way since the Hegemony War.
Better power systems, more efficient weapon arrays, improved structural integrity. Your naval architects should be commended.
But they're still thinking in terms of individual ships rather than integrated systems. Marcus pointed to specific elements in the fleet formation.
Each vessel is optimized for independent operation, which makes them resilient against certain types of attack but limits their effectiveness as coordinated units. The Imperial fleet operates as a unified force, Thexbar objected. The Imperial fleet operates as a collection of ships following the same orders, Marcus replied.
There's a difference. Before Thexbar could respond, every communication system in the holding bay activated simultaneously.
The voice that emerged from the speakers carried the authority of absolute power, backed by centuries of tradition and the weight of an empire that spans star systems.
Prisoner 7741, the voice said, you will present yourself for immediate transportation to the flagship Dominion. You have 5 minutes to comply.
Marcus looked up from his accounting pad with mild interest.
Emperor Zephian himself? I'm honored. Though I should point out that I'm not actually refusing to comply, I've been quite cooperative throughout this entire process.
You have subverted Imperial security systems, accessed classified information, and made threats against Imperial economic stability. I've had conversations, shared publicly available mathematical analysis, and offered economic consulting services, Marcus replied. If that constitutes subversion, then your definition of the term is broader than I realized.
You will present yourself for transportation. Now. Marcus stood up and walked toward the front of his cell.
The energy barrier that should have contained him remained stubbornly inactive, allowing him to step through empty air as if nothing existed to stop him. Actually, he said, I think I'd prefer to stay here for a bit longer. I've been having such interesting conversations with my fellow passengers, and we were just getting to the good part. The silence that followed was pregnant with implications. Throughout the bay, prisoners held their breath as they waited to see how an imperial emperor would respond to being refused by someone who claimed to be guilty of tax evasion. Explain your refusal, the emperor's voice said finally. Well, Marcus said, settling back onto his bench, it occurs to me that transportation to your flagship would place me in a controlled environment where our conversation might be influenced by the fact that you have several thousand heavily armed soldiers at your disposal.
You question imperial hospitality? I question imperial neutrality.
If we're going to discuss economic partnerships and technological cooperation, it would be better to do so in a setting where both parties feel equally secure.
You feel insecure? Marcus laughed, and the sound carried genuine amusement.
Your Majesty, I'm sitting in a prison cell aboard a transport surrounded by the most powerful fleet in known space, having a conversation with beings who could order my execution with a single word.
If I felt insecure, I wouldn't be able to function at all. Then, explain your position.
Simple. I prefer to conduct business negotiations in environments where all parties have equal incentive to reach mutually beneficial agreements. Flagship command centers tend to bias conversations toward solutions that favor whoever controls the flagship.
Emperor Zephian was silent for a long moment.
When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones that suggested he was reassessing fundamental assumptions about how this conversation should proceed.
What environment would you consider appropriate for such discussions?
Oh, this is perfect, Marcus replied immediately. Neutral territory, interested observers, security measures that protect everyone equally.
We couldn't have designed a better conference room if we'd tried.
You wish to conduct interstellar diplomatic negotiations in a prison transport holding bay. I've had worse venues for business meetings, Marcus said.
Besides, there's something to be said for the honesty of the environment.
No ceremonial protocols, no diplomatic niceties, no pretense that this is anything other than a practical discussion about mutual interests.
Another pause.
Marcus could imagine the frantic consultations taking place aboard the flagship as Imperial advisors tried to develop protocols for a situation that had no precedence in galactic history.
Very well, the Emperor said finally. We will proceed with negotiations in your preferred environment.
However, I will be represented by proxy, as Imperial security protocols prohibit the Emperor from entering prisoner holding areas.
Perfectly understandable, Marcus said. Though I should mention that I'll also be represented by proxy for this discussion. You are already present. Actually, no. I'm Marcus Chen, accountant and financial consultant.
For this conversation, you'll need to speak with my associates who handle the political and technological aspects of human civilization. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the air in the center of the holding bay began to shimmer. Not the controlled energy projection of a holographic display, but something that seemed to bend reality itself around a focal point that existed in several dimensions simultaneously. Two figures materialized from what appeared to be empty space.
The first was clearly human, though her appearance suggested technological modifications that transcended anything in current galactic databases.
She wore what looked like formal business attire, but the fabric seemed to be woven from light itself, and her eyes held depths that hinted at information processing capabilities beyond biological limitations.
The second figure defied easy categorization.
It maintained a roughly humanoid shape, but its form seemed to be composed of living mathematics, geometric patterns that shifted and flowed according to principles that made observers' eyes water when they tried to focus on specific details.
Emperor Zephian, the woman said, her voice carrying easily through the bay despite the fact that she didn't appear to be using any artificial amplification. I am Ambassador Sarah Kim, representing the Human Collective's diplomatic corps. My companion is Coordinator 77 Alpha of the Human Collective's Technological Integration Council.
The mathematical figure spoke in harmonics that bypassed auditory processing entirely, delivering meaning directly to the consciousness of anyone within range.
We are prepared to discuss terms of mutual cooperation and economic integration.
Impossible, Emperor Zephian said.
Our sensors detect no transportation method, no energy signatures consistent with matter transmission, no evidence of how these beings arrived in a secured environment.
Marcus looked up from his accounting pad with obvious pride. I told you our technology had advanced during our absence. 3 centuries of uninterrupted research and development tends to produce interesting results.
Ambassador Kim turned toward Marcus with what might have been affection.
Marcus has provided excellent preliminary economic analysis and threat assessment data. His recommendations formed the basis of our negotiating position.
I do try to be thorough, Marcus said modestly.
Emperor Zephian's voice carried new harmonics, caution, fascination, and perhaps the first stirrings of genuine respect.
You are prepared to offer formal negotiations between our civilizations.
We are prepared to offer partnership, Ambassador Kim corrected. The human collective has no interest in traditional interstellar politics based on territorial expansion and resource competition. We prefer cooperative frameworks that benefit all participants.
Coordinator 77 Alpha's mathematical voice resonated with certainty. Current galactic economic paradigms operate at approximately 12% of theoretical efficiency.
Integration with human collective systems could increase output by factors exceeding current imperial comprehension.
Explain. Ambassador Kim gestured, and the holding bay transformed.
Not through holographic projection, but through actual modification of the surrounding matter.
Walls became transparent, revealing the vast fleet formations outside. Floors displayed real-time economic data from throughout imperial space. Ceilings showed three-dimensional models of possible technological integration scenarios.
The human collective operates on principles of cooperative resource optimization, she explained.
Instead of extracting wealth from conquered territories, we generate wealth through technological innovation and efficient resource utilization.
The displays showed comparison models, current imperial economic output versus projections for integrated human imperial systems. The differences were staggering, suggesting prosperity levels that would make current imperial wealth look like primitive subsistence living. These projections assume voluntary cooperation, Ambassador Kim continued. Technological transfer, economic integration, and political partnership between sovereign entities.
Not conquest, not subjugation, not absorption into a larger imperial structure. And if the empire chooses not to participate in such cooperation? Coordinator 77 Alpha's response carried mathematical certainty. Non-participation remains a viable option. Human collective systems will continue operating independently. Imperial systems will continue operating at current efficiency levels. But, Ambassador Kim added, non-participation would preclude access to collaborative benefits. The gap between human collective capabilities and traditional galactic technologies will continue expanding over time.
Marcus looked up from his calculations.
It's really quite simple mathematics, Your Majesty.
You can choose to participate in the new economic paradigm, or you can choose to compete against it.
But you can't choose to ignore it. You're offering ultimatum disguised as partnership.
I'm offering partnership disguised as an ultimatum, Marcus corrected.
There's an important difference. Emperor Zeph Yen was quiet for a long moment.
Around the bay, prisoners who had witnessed the entire exchange sat in stunned silence. They had watched a human accountant transform what should have been an interrogation and execution into negotiations that could reshape galactic civilization.
What specific terms do you propose? The Emperor asked finally.
Ambassador Kim smiled, and, for the first time in the conversation, she looked entirely human.